Today's video is brought to you in part by two different things. Firstly is that someone going under VictorHF actually drew me in a small little character portrait. It was very nice of him and it looks awesome, and it just invigorated me to come and work on another Pokemon video as my next one up. Secondly is that it's kind of a celebration of sorts, as one of my videos actually managed to reach 5,000 views. It's absolutely mind-blowing, to me at least. I note that today's YouTube space is more or less about the sub count and this and that and whatever. I would like to get there someday, but just to know that 5,000 people, 10,000 if you count all of my Pokemon videos together, actually took the time out of their day to watch me, it makes me very happy, at the very least. More so if I manage to entertain you in one way or another. But regardless, let's get on to today's video. Let's get things started. Hey guys, Hattopy here. I've sort of mentioned it before, maybe not, but regardless, I'm going to just clarify it here now. I would describe myself as a hardcore casual Pokemon player. I don't get right down to the nitty gritty about the stat growths and the IVs and the EVs and all that stuff that comes with the more perfectionist or completionist nature of Pokemon. To be fair, I do that with a lot of games I play. That's not to say that I don't find any entertainment with that sort of league of Pokemon. I get quite the kick out of watching a lot of the Pokemon championships and seeing what kind of strategies they come up with. Rather, I'm more passionate about the world I'm exploring, the characters and Pokemon living in there, the plot that drives my reasoning to do good in said world, and a little bit about the Pokemon, the types, the abilities that they have, and the kinds of attacks I utilize in combat. To that end, I've sort of developed a philosophy as to how I assemble my team each time I play through a generation of Pokemon. And I don't really leave it up to chance either, since with Generation 1 to 4, I was always late on picking up those games, so I always knew from friends and whatever about who was where. And with Generation 5 onward, well, the entire Pokedexes were leaked on the internet beforehand anyways, so I always did my research as to what kind of team I wanted to assemble for that playthrough. In that regard, why don't we take a look at my prerequisites a little bit and see how they compare to yours maybe. Firstly, above all else, my starter is always facing the Pokemon League by the end of the game. I've kind of seen and heard of some people that ditch their starters partway through for whatever reason. All I can say to that is, you monster! How could you ditch your very first friend? Ugh, jeez. I mean, I don't even quite understand it myself. Your starter is usually a lot better than a lot of other Pokemon you'll find out in the wild. I mean, maybe you might be speedrunning the game and that Pokemon becomes obsolete in some fashion, but other than that, just, ugh, wow. I always have at least one water type and one flying type Pokemon for the sole purpose of being traveling HM fodder, but more specifically because Fly and Surf are the only HMs that I don't mind using as basic attacks. All other ones usually get reserved for HM slaves, but that's beside the point. I usually try to get at least one type mimicking the starters as well. Grass types usually find an easier way in, since fire types are fairly hard to get in a lot of generations. And I usually also find a way to get at least one ground type into my team as well, to help deal with those pesky electric type Pokemon. Waiting a long time to find a Pokemon that may only be in my party for a couple hours before I actually face the Elite Four doesn't really suit me all that well, so I usually try to fill my team as soon as I possibly can. And finally, unless it was absolutely necessary, I try to not have more than 2 of the same typing on a team. Depending on the pairings, I might exempt it, but usually I try to keep the amount lower. With all that said, let's take all that information and put it to practical use. Let's take a nostalgic trip down memory lane and go through each of my first teams that I set up each time I played through a different generation. Now, this list is going to be somewhat liberal, as if I talked about the very first team that I did in Generation 1, all you're going to find is one overpowered Charizard and a bunch of low-level randoms that I eventually thought to throw a Pokeball at with my 4-year-old mind, not really thinking about that too often. Rather, my first team on my first legitimate playthrough looked more like this. I picked Charmander, because of course I did, and then I caught a female Nidoran as I was playing Pokemon Red, and I needed it to deal with Brock. Along the way in Viridian Forest, I always stopped to catch a Pikachu. And fun fact, the first time that I ever caught one was in this little patch of grass right here. And it's the only place I've ever caught them, so as a sort of good luck charm, whenever I try to catch one, I always go for a Pikachu within that area. After Brock in Route 3, I caught a Spearow to become my flyer for Generation 1, since Charizard couldn't learn Fly in that generation for some reason. Along the way, just before Mount Moon, I always bought the Magikarp from the salesman, since it's the fastest way to actually get one into your team, and I was going to use one anyways. And finally, to round out the team, I always caught an Oddish north of Cerulean City to help deal with Misty. Generation 1's team filled before the second badge. For Gen 2, I always picked Cyndaquil because, of course I did. It's the best thing since sliced bread, that one. I always played later in the day for that generation, so I always encountered Hoothoots, and owls are pretty cool, and especially these guys, they can learn psychic type attacks and reflect and even fly. So I picked that as my flyer for that generation. And at the Sprout Tower, I always caught the Ghastly there. But what was interesting was that I didn't really have anyone around me to trade with, so it actually remained a Haunter until the end of time. After being Faulkner, Route 32 had a double whammy of Mareeps and Whoopers, both fairly helpful Pokemon with particular interest in Quagsire, since it was practically the sole reason I could beat Red way back in the day. And finally, to round it all out, after finding Bill in Equitique City, I always backtracked back to get the Eevee from him, which I eventually made into an Umbreon. Generation 2's team filled just before the 4th gym. Generation 3 starts out with me picking Mudkip this go around. Everyone always talked about how cool Blaziken was and why they always picked him, and I just wanted my cute little Mudkip. He was good enough for me. I then explored all throughout Route 102, to which I eventually found a Ralts and a Seedot, both of whom I found to be a lot easier to find way back in the day than I did now. Are you kidding me, Wally? That was the first thing you found was a Ralts? Ugh, gross. Just before Brawly, I always explored the caves blind without flash, because by just bumping into the walls and running around or whatever, I was lazy like that. And I always found an Aeron in there, which were pretty cool. And after getting the Go Goggles, I always went to the desert and picked up a Trapinch, as well as going down and picking up a fossil, the Claw one more specifically, to make into an Anorith. Generation 3 team filled just after the 4th gym. Generation 4 begins with me taking a Turtwig under my care. Just before Jubilife City, I also always picked up a Starly and a Shinx along the way. Right by the Valley Windworks, I would go and pick up a Shellos as my surfer. And finally, to round everyone out, in Pastoria City at the Great Marsh, I always picked up a Skorupi and a Krogunk. Generation 4's team filled just after the 2nd gym. Generation 5 Black and White was an interesting case for me, since I built my team first and then picked the starter to complement the group, since Generation 5 starters were kind of my least favorite amongst all of them. But regardless, this is how my first team played out. I ended with deciding on picking Snivy first. I would then have to also pick up a Panpour, since it was practically necessary to beat the first gym. I also explored extensively Wellspring Cave to try to find a Drillbur. Ugh, I was swimming in gems by the end of that, I certainly remember that one. And just outside Pinwheel Forest, I replaced Panpour with Timepool, since Seismitoad was going to be way more useful than what Simipour ever was going to be. In the Desert Resort and the Relic Castle, I picked the Plume Fossil to get Arken out of it. Not really my best choice to pick. I would have preferred to pick Braviary, but by the time you're able to pick up a Rufflet, it's way too late in the game, and Unpheasant just looks stupid to me. So although Defeatus is one of the worst abilities in the game, I picked Arcane basically being the lesser of two evils. Chargestone Cave also had Joltik and Ninjas, always a great combination there. And finally, Dragon Spiral Tower had Golett for me to capture. Black and White's team is filled just after the 7th gym. For Black 2 and White 2, I wanted to pick a starter that I hadn't actually picked yet, and I'd already picked Tepig and Snivy for each of playthrough that I did for Black and White respectively. So with this go around, I decided to pick Oshawott as my starter. At Flockacy Ranch, they had Mareeps and Riolus there, with the Verbank complex having Growlithe as well. Shortly after rediscovering the mainland, the desert resort also had Trapinches for me to get there, with just outside Mombasa City having Gothittas lurking about the area. Black 2 White 2 team filled just after the 4th gym. Generation 6 was an interesting case because there was a lot of Pokemon at such a wide variety early on for me to pick from. And even this go around too also had 2 starters that I can pick from. Eventually I settled on picking Froakie, with Charmander being my backup starter. Route 8 had Inkay there for me to capture, which I was very lucky because I managed to get one with Contrary as its ability, not 100% knowing what it did, only to be genuinely surprised later on. Reflection Cave, on the way there, I managed to get a Helioptile, as well as getting an Amora from the fossil within the cave, both just dang adorable Pokemon. And just north of Silage City, I managed to find a wide variety of Pokemon to pick from, with me eventually settling on another Golett. Generation 6 team filled just before the 2nd gym. And finally, Generation 7. This one kind of breaks a few pre-established rules since ride Pokemon are a thing, completely eliminating HMs. That and, well, I didn't realize how long it took for you to get to Vast Pony Canyon, in which case I might have picked a Pikachu to get an Alolan Raichu instead of picking a Grubbin and a few other situations, but regardless, here's how my first team played out. I started with a Popplio, winning the Generation 7 lottery. I then also picked up a Grubbin very early on. At the Lush Jungle, there was a Fomantis, with the Well of Volcano having a female Salandite, coming pretty much right away. I had heard the horror stories of people trying to find a female Salandite, and it funnily took me like no time at all. At Tapu Village, there was an Alolan Vulpix there, which was great since its Evolution Stone came pretty much right after. And finally, at the Vast Pony Canyon, I decided to shake things up a little bit, and I caught a Jangmo-O there. Generation 7 team filled just before the final trial. So as you can see, only twice did my teams get filled fairly late into a game, with 2 other ones coming just before the 2nd gym. And sure, there were some instances where I would have liked to have had some other Pokemon on my team, like I would have liked to have had a Seadra rather than a Gyarados, or maybe having a Lantern or an Electros, but those guys kind of got outshined by some other Pokemon. And I would eventually use those types of Pokemon in later playthroughs, but it's always the first team that stood out the most to me. And let me know what you guys think, if you can remember, what your first teams were like. Maybe you picked a Pidgeot over a Fearow, maybe you liked Totodile over Cyndaquil more, or maybe you painstakingly went through Black and White to eventually get a Dino at the end of it. Whatever it was, leave a comment down below, let me know what they were. I'd love to be able to discuss what kind of teams they were and anything else you might have to add. But anywho, thank you all so much for watching. If you like what you saw, you can click right up here to check out some of my other videos that I've done. Or if you really feel like it, you can click right up here to subscribe. And until next time guys, I will see you all later.